All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
So nice to see all of you here. This beautiful spring weather and Mother's Day celebration couldn't be better. And today we're so happy to have Sandra and Joe back with us. So it's an honor. Super happy to see them in our new house. And Joe is going to give a lecture to us, talk about Emmanuel. Right, as you can see, the spiritual guide of Chico, past lives, partnership, literacy, legacy, and divine mission, which is amazing. Very interesting topic we're going to talk about today. And as we normally do, we're going to have a reading in the beginning, and that's going to be by Danielle, which is coming up very soon. And right after that, we have the lecture, and then we have the passes afterwards. So again, for those of you joining online, thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone can now connect with our master and our creator so we can have this session that we're going to start now. Thank you all, and then we're going to start with Daniel with our reading. Daniel. Yeah, I know. Beautiful.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Okay, I'm going to start. Some people cultivate truth and make it a weapon to attack others. The truth, however, is a wondrous light, dispeller of darkness that never wounds or afflicts. It is like bread, which should be eaten without excess, or like lymph, which needs to be absorbed in the exact quantity necessary. While the truth nourishes and slakes the thirst, it calms and makes happy, thus enriching the understanding and affability the person who penetrates it. Never apply truth with harshness, as if it were a weapon to destroy others. When this happens, it loses its main purpose, which is to liberate.
So let us all now close our eyes and keep here connected with the good spirits here present in our house, our benefactors. And above all, keep connected with the Jesus, our Master, and with the God, our Creator. And let's thank for the opportunity for being here to listen to this blessed lecture that will be given by our friend Joe. And may our spiritual guides guide him through all this lecture. May we all open our hearts and our minds to the lessons of today. And so be it. Joe,
Thank you, Teresa. Good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
Special morning to all of the mothers, current mothers, previous mothers, and mothers to be as well. Lecture today is about the Spirit Emmanuel. And when I got the assignment to this lecture, I was thinking, well, what can we do to talk about Emmanuel? Could have gone a lot of different ways. A lot of them very boring, just kind of relating, the historical aspects of Emmanuel. So I'm going to do a little bit of that because that's important for us to understand, especially those who might be new to Spiritism. For those who have been Spiritists for a while, especially those coming from Brazil, this will all be kind of old news because we all know about Emmanuel to some extent. Maybe we'll have a little bit of tidbits here that you might not know or remember. But what I wanted to do today is to mirror Emmanuel's journey to our own. And you might say, well, that's a little bit, exaggerated. I mean, this is such a great spirit. How can you mirror his journey to ours? Well, we have to always remember that no spirit is created great. We're all born or created by God the same way, simple and ignorant. It is through our journey, through our many, many reincarnations, that we learn and we progress and we become the evolved spirits at some point in time. It's probably fair to say that Emmanuel has started on this journey a long time ago. And we'll talk a little bit about what we know and what we heard about his previous lives. But he had to go, or she had to go, because we don't know if there were other genders through all his reincarnations. He had to go through many, many different types of experience, which is true for us as well. We are here today, we are incarnated, we are self-aware, we are our level of evolution. We don't think about our prior experiences. How do we get here? We all have our own individual journeys. We probably met one another's through some of those experiences. But ultimately, it is our path, our evolution, that has created the individual that we are. So let's get started on this journey. And first of all, the importance of Spiritism in Brazil. I just want to kind of just introduce how Emmanuel played such an important part on how Spiritism established itself in Brazil. We know that Allan Kardec started the codification in the 19th century in France. But towards the end of that century, the spirits, especially those who were guiding the evolution of this planet, realized that the world was going towards very dangerous times that ended up occurring as two great wars in the early 20th century. And that those two wars would be mostly centered in Europe, especially in France. So there was a concern that a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the wisdom that started with Allan Kardec's codification could somehow be lost for a long time. So they started to prepare another place, one that would not be so centered to those two wars, to make sure that this information, this legacy, would be preserved. And Brazil was chosen for that. So we already had, even in late 19th century, some, especially doctors, interestingly enough, who had studied. It was very common that the elite of the most educated people in Brazil would do their studies in France. France was the heart, the center of the educated Western world at that time. So a lot of the more privileged people who got to get a very high level of education, including doctors, would study in France. And as such, the books were being translated now from French to Portuguese and making it available to the population. And it was a wise choice to select doctors because they have a mission of their own. They have a tendency to be people who like to help others in need. Whereas in France, Spiritism was, to a certain extent, focused on more of the intellectual elite that was trying to understand all of the consequences of what Spiritism was telling them. In Brazil, the focus shifted to a wider population, a wider audience, especially among the underprivileged. So we had doctors that would come in and would translate to Portuguese, and it would start to educate their patients, right? Their clientele, especially in some of the poor areas of Rio de Janeiro and other states. But still, this was very incipient. It was, it was growing organically to a certain extent. And it really only took off, honestly, with Chico Xavier. Chico was not the first. He was not the pioneer, but he was like the seed that exploded. It was through his works and his exposure, public exposure, that Spiritism really created roots in Brazil. And it was just, was the right time as well, right? He was born in 1910. So by the time he started really acting upon his mediunic capabilities, he was in his late teens, early 20s. So now you're talking between wars, 1930s or so. And by that time, radio was becoming a huge, well, it was already a huge thing, right? Newspapers were widely available. People were getting more and more information. So unlike what would have happened 30 or 40 years before, we now had this mass media available to start to describe or tell the story what Chico was doing. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Chico because that's a lecture on its own. But we all know that Chico wrote over 400 books. Some of them were, many of them were messages that he was receiving. They were more of a collection of these messages. Others were entire books, and we're going to talk about those today. So without Chico, without his dedication, his work, Spiritism would not be what it is in Brazil and globally, because Brazil did hold the fort during the two great wars to maintain and grow the awareness around Spiritism, and it basically led the way to what it is today. So did Chico do this by himself? Of course not. See, we know that Chico was a medium. He wasn't particularly one of those mostly highly educated individuals, right? Although, of course, he was educated to a certain extent, but he was a normal person, right? Eventually, he got a job as a public servant. So if you were to go back in a time machine and meet Chico in his early days and as a teenager, you would not find him much different than the others, teenagers at the time. And he was living in a very small town in Brazil. It's still kind of a small town today, Pedro Leopoldo, but back then it was even smaller. It's like rural area, the last place you would think someone like Chico would spring up. So how did it happen? Well, Emmanuel happened, right? Emmanuel is, as we're going to talk just now, is a spirit who became Chico's guide through his life journey, through his mission. And we'll talk about how did that happen and what was the consequence of all of this. Well, first of all, what was the outcome? And what was the kind of relationship that existed between Chico and Emmanuel? And in fact, it kind of set the mode, the pattern for other important mediums, that they would have, obviously, ability to communicate with many different spirits, and Chico did psychograph books from a number of different spirits. But ultimately, there's one that becomes their guide, one that is kind of like their mentor in all aspects, right? And that's very important because it shaped Chico in a way that he would dedicate his life and how his mission would be realized in the many years that he was in this planet. So Emmanuel, a spirit, like I said, like all of us, he had to go through many different reincarnations. He was not created with the wisdom and the abilities that he has. These are the 5 kind of principal reincarnations that we kind of understand existed, but there are people who describe up to 10 or more different lives, including apparently that he has reincarnated and he's among us someplace in Brazil. The earliest that I saw was a reference that he was incarnated in Egypt in the 9th century before Christ. and he was linked to a religious role in that aspect. But we don't have a lot of documentation about this. But in any case, let's assume that that's the case. He starts in Egypt, so 9th century, we're the 20th century, so that's 21st, so that's 3,000 years ago. So you can see that he very likely had many more other reincarnations that we do not know about. And this is important to know that each life that we have and he had a bit of a purpose. It was to teach us maybe just one thing or one collection of things that we needed to learn. The first kind of more important life that we know is back in the 1st century. He was a Roman, a very influential Roman called Publius Lentulus, and he was very important. So this was a time that Emmanuel now had a taste of power, right? With all the good and the bad things that come out of it. We don't know all the details, but we can assume that he made many mistakes. He had the same vices, the same kind of deficiencies, moral deficiencies that we might have, especially someone in such a high role in a world where very few commended many. Well, I guess we're still in that world, but that's a different story. So this is actually documented in one of the books that we're going to talk about. 50 years later, he comes back as Nestorius, slave now. So you see how things are interesting, how our reincarnation plans take shape. In one life, you're this really important person that basically can decide anything you want to do about your life. You're in control, right? You have privileges, advantages, power. And the fact that he comes back as a slave already tells us that he didn't get everything right the first time, the previous time, right? But this is part of our learning process. That was part of his learning process of understanding the various facets of human relationships, of power, of suffering, of our ability to be aware that everyone has different needs, but we're all human. We're all the same spirits that God has created. Many, many centuries later, we see him coming back as Padre Damiano, Father Damiano. He is now religious. And if we believe that he was religious back in Egypt, he's now back in religion. So if you look at the path, he started as a religious in a time where things were still very controlled, right, through the religions of the Egyptians on the various gods. He becomes very powerful. Next life, he loses those powers. He is now subjected to all of the sufferings that a slave would have. So he comes now like what? Like a priest, someone who is there to help people like Nestorius against people like Publius. He's the middleman. He's supposed to defend those who cannot defend by themselves. And along the way, there were a couple of more lives that he had. One as a Roman soldier, and then as a poor fisherman, also in Roman times. These are possible incarnations. We don't know as much, but it makes sense, right? So each one of these has different facets. A Roman soldier. What is the life of a soldier? Is one that is decided and commended by the structure, rigid structure of his army. One that has to follow orders, maybe against their moral inclinations. Or maybe they didn't have the moral inclinations yet, and they had to do things in war or not in war that they would not be proud of once they go back to the spiritual world. As a fisherman, he's back now to poverty, not as a slave. He's a free man that has to work, has to deal with the challenges of a job, has to sell his merchandise. So he's a merchant to a certain extent, a very small one, very simple. So as you see, these are not randomly chosen. There is a logic to what may seem like a bit of a chaos, up and down, left and right, and so forth. Because imagine that you're starting on a new company, a very big company. What do many companies do? They took the intern and start going around all the various departments so they can find the right spot where their skill set and their motivation is best suited. This happens to us as well. Emmanuel is known because he became such an important role in what would become now the Spiritism in Brazil. But it is not unlike what we have faced in our own journeys. So keep that in mind when you see somebody in a different role that may not be doing things that you don't agree with. Remember that you might have been that person in a previous life, doing similar things in those shoes that they're wearing right now. So all of this, so Emmanuel's been going through, like I said, 3,000 year running up through all these lives, suffering, learning, and going forth. And then suddenly, this boy is born in Pedro Leopoldo, 1910. His name is Francisco Xavier, right? And the two will eventually meet, and that meeting will change Spiritism in Brazil. So again, I won't talk too much about Chico, but enough to know that Chico demonstrated medium capabilities very early on. His family realized this. His family had friends and relations to some people who were already educating in Spiritism, and especially a lady by the name Carmen Pena Peracio. And she would become an important person in the early days of Chico coming to understand his capabilities. Chico was a teenager, 17, 16, and he started to go to the meetings at Dona Carmen. One record shows that the spirit Emmanuel first comes to one of these meetings with Carmen, Dona Carmen, in 1927, when Chico would have been 17 years old. But that was just first contact that Emmanuel had with the group, Pedro Leopoldo. He would have to wait for Chico to mature a bit. But Chico was already starting to grow in his capabilities of psychographing books. He was already working on Palácio do Além Túmulo, which is a collection of stories by dead Brazilian authors and poets. And in 1931, Chico was trying to understand what was happening to him. He was very young, right? And didn't have the ability to Google or to understand what was happening with him, right? He had obviously the guidance of Dona Carmen, and in the story goes that he was praying by this river in Pedro Leopoldo, by the tree, sitting on a rock, and then Emmanuel comes to him, right? And it's described as a strong man, robust man, looking like a noble. So it's coming in as Publius, most likely, to impress Chico. I mean, if he came in as a slave, maybe Chico would not have been as impressed. But the whole idea was that Chico is completely taken by surprise, and Emmanuel introduces himself, right? And asks a question, a challenge to Chico. If he was ready now to make a commitment. And Chico didn't understand exactly what the commitment was. The commitment would be to fulfill the mission that had been given to him or agreed by him when he was still disincarnated, before he incarnated as this person, to be the co-author, to be the hand that would write over 400 different literary items, books, and collections over, these many years that he would be on this earth. He was he died 2002, would have been 92 years old. Yeah. And Emmanuel was not sugarcoating it, right? He was being as blunt as he could be, saying, this is not going to be easy. You will not have a life like other people. You will be dedicated. You will need to commit to 3 things. And this is the famous 3 conditions for Chico to accept Emmanuel's offer. And they were discipline, discipline, and discipline. So the discipline here is to wake up every day, be prepared to do the work, do this for every day of his life. And the work is not just psychographing messages or books, but also pushing forward Spiritism in Brazil through his charitable work, through his example as a Spiritist, what it means to be a Spiritist, and that this would consume his entire life. And of course, we know that Chico said yes, and they would become partners. So this was 1931, but Emmanuel still had to prepare Chico. It's not just, okay, let's start, let's do the work. Again, back to the idea of someone starting a company. You don't become a vice president a week after you join. I know a lot of the Gen Z folks thinks that that's how it works, but it doesn't work that way. You have to go through the work, and this work would be that he would psychograph books in between from other Spiritists, but he was not ready for Emmanuel until 7 years later, in 1938, when the first book, aptly called Emmanuel, was published. And by the way, Emmanuel, it was not any of the names of his previous lives, so why did he introduce himself as Emmanuel? Emmanuel is an important name in the Bible, the Old Testament, but also it means God among us, right? So he did not want to fix him to one particular incarnation or title. He basically wanted to put forth the idea that the work that they would be doing would be to bring God to all of those who would be privileged or fortunate to hear the message. So Emmanuel was not an easy mentor. He was a tough mentor, right? But he needed to be, right? The discipline. Who among us can say that we are disciplined every day of our lives, right? But he had somebody who was with him 724. So yeah, I don't think any of us would volunteer to this life, but that's how he worked, right? And of course, Emmanuel taught Chico not just the words that he would put, but how he would behave, how would he treat others, right? It was subtle, constant, and sometimes he would pull Chico's ears for not being as disciplined as he should be. And Chico said that maybe at one point, can I take a rest? Can I take some vacation? When does it come? And Emmanuel is famous to say, work during the day, at night you don't have to work. And there's another one that says that, you can take a vacation when Jesus does. And more importantly, and this is something crucial, especially those among you who might be inclined to have some mediumnic leadership capabilities, and that he stressed very strongly that Chico was not to make any personal gains from all the things, all the gifts that would be given to him freely, they would have to be given to others equally freely. All the royalties of the books, any donations, would go to the charity that he would establish that would feed the poor, it feed them both materially with food, but also spiritually to the lessons that they would show. And this is a rule that unfortunately a lot of mediums eventually fail. They get, what's the word? They get enchanted by their egos, that they're doing something that is unique, that makes them better, superior, and then they want to benefit from that. And soon, whatever gifts that had been given to them will eventually cease. And they no longer become the faithful messengers that they have proposed to be when they first came into this mission. So Chico, along the way, obviously talked about Emmanuel. It was a partnership for many decades. He described Emmanuel as clear, loving, but firm, which is a good example to all parents, especially in today of Mother's Day, right? He was guiding Chico as his son. And fidelity, right? Principles in terms of the ethical heart of Spiritism. Because he knew Chico would become famous. Chico was very famous at his time, especially in the 50s and the 60s. He would be the first medium that actually goes on television, right? He is exposed to a level of attention, fame, that he was obviously never really prepared for. And if it wasn't for Emmanuel keeping him on track, he could have lost his way. And when he will also describe that during these events or these interviews, and he would feel the presence of Emmanuel through all those moments. And he would see taps when Emmanuel thought he was doing okay. He would also get a stronger tap if he wasn't doing okay. And he also made a point that, in a way, that we try to do here at the TSS as well, is to always be loyal to Jesus and Allan Kardec, to the real message of Spiritism, not intermediaries who might want to interpret it the way that they feel it's more appropriate. So it's this fidelity to the basic tenets of Spiritism, which, by the way, they can evolve. Spiritism is a self-correcting philosophy that can evolve with time, but we shouldn't lose track that there were certain things that basically are the foundation, the pillars of what we do. Now, there were over 100 different publications between Chico and Emmanuel, but they are mostly known for two very different kind of series or collections. One is what we call the historical collections, or romances, and the other one is the gospel commentaries, the Living Spring, Fonte Viva series. And interesting, it's not like psychographed one series and then started the other. The two were being done in parallel and interchanging over time, right? And they now really create the most basic work of activity, besides what Chico would then do later with André Luiz, or from Emmanuel. These are the books that really create the foundation, and every spiritist, if they have the opportunity, should read it. Most of them, if not all of these, have been translated to English now. So the historical romance collection of 5 books, and I'll talk a little bit about some of these. 2,000 years ago, 50 years later, Renunciation, Paul and Stephen, great book, and then Hail Christ. And the themes, written as a story, as a romance, talk about his past incarnations. Right? It's almost like a biography, but he is not the main character of the biography. He is just an observer of what's happening along the stories. Right? About early Christianity, moral, and many historical lessons of how Christianity defeated all the odds of growing and becoming what it eventually became through the centuries. It was those early few decades that were crucial to the survival and then to the growth of Christianism. The Gospel Commentary Collection, this Living Springs. There are many books, but here are the key ones: the Way, the Truth, and the Life, Our Daily Bread, Vineyards of Light, Living Spring, Words of Eternal Life. So these are all based on the gospel now. Each one focus on certain aspects of the gospel through a spiritist lens now. How you shape it, what it means, and what was Christ explaining 2,000 years ago in a way that was appropriate for the people listening to him at the time, and how Spiritism brings additional light. So there's a lot of light in these books, because that's all he's doing. He's not trying to change the messages. He's just trying to explain them in terms of this living spring of knowledge, of spiritual guidance. So quickly through the various books, 2,000 years ago, 1938. So this was published at the same time that the other book was published, which was called Emmanuel, right? So Chico was writing both of these, or Emmanuel was dictating both of them. Emmanuel basically describes some key points that Emmanuel was laying out, as basically is kind of a precursor of all of the things that Emmanuel would write over the decades. And this is the stories of Publius Lentulus, who was a senator, and he eventually crosses paths with Jesus and the very initial followers of Jesus. So he blends historical fiction, a lot of spiritual insights, and the transformation. A lot of spiritist novels or romances are about transformation, and we'll see this as a major theme of how we evolve. Transformation is another way of describing evolution, right? It's a very fascinating book. And then it's followed by what happens a few decades later, 50 years later, right? And here is the stories of the slave Nestorius, right? Talks about the power of forgiveness, unresolved guilt, right? So these are very pertinent even today. And the redemptive journey of the soul. Again, journey, transformation, evolution. And underlying all of these books in the series is the strength of love. Love for Jesus, for God, but love for one another. So now this story moves forward 3 centuries ahead. Hail Christ, 3rd century, Christians face persecutions. So this is, again, telling the story of how Christianism almost didn't make it, right? There was a point that it could have been kind of genocide away from the future. But through the work, through the sacrifice, especially of many people, with courage, hope, eventually the victory of the Spirit. Paul Stevens, my favorite, talks about, again, another transformation now of Saul, a Jewish persecutor of Christians in his first part of his life, until he has this experience with Jesus. And it transforms him, and he becomes Paul. And this is kind of goes back in time a bit to the very early days of Christianism. And few people are more responsible for the creation of the church than Paul. Through his advocacy, through his travels, he established the foundations of what the church would become. Its book has a lot of historical content that it's worth reading. But again, the key messages here is that no matter what you have done, and he did a lot of bad things as Saul, there's always a point where you can redeem yourself. You can see a better path of how you should progress. All of these books extremely, extremely inspirational above anything else. And then the Consoler is structured more as questions and answers, right? 411 questions, not unlike the Spirit's book, right? Again, it's a book you can come back to many, many times and continue to reread a lot of these questions, because every time you read them, it impacts you in a little different way, because you're not the same person that you were from the first time you read. And here's the Living Spring collection. We have done many book clubs here at the TSS doing the studies of one or more of these books. It's really enjoyable reading. It's not hard, and it does provide a lot of moral and especially spiritual background for us to understand the gospel better than just trying to read it outright. So, what do you think Emmanuel's mission was? His first mission, evolve as a spirit, right? Go through the work, go through the suffering, go through the many, many lives that it took him to learn, to fine-tune, to evolve, to become lighter. That is the same mission that we all share with Emmanuel. Right? And Emmanuel actually also shows up in Kardec's books, right? So that was the first mission. The second mission is, as part of the spirits who were guiding Kardec, he was also then responsible for that transition that we discussed of bringing Spiritism to Brazil. So he had to find the right partner. When I say he, obviously it's always done as a collective, right? And he did not choose Chico, after Chico was born. The selection process took, I would presume, many decades. And Chico himself, his spirit, would have been started to be prepared for what would become his mission of becoming the co-author of Emmanuel. Emmanuel, always very faithful to the basic tenets of Spiritism, through Christ's teachings, through the gospel, around charity, humility, and service. And just a side note, so happy that the new Pope that has just been anointed is someone who shares this same feeling as Pope Francis, who just passed away. Emmanuel consistently insisted on the harmony between faith and reason. It goes back to the point I made just a bit earlier around Spiritism being kind of a self-correcting philosophy, religion, science. We don't know everything that we need to know. We're not ready for that. But Spiritism is not something that is forged into a hard model or dogmas. It's based on some solid moral principles, but beyond that, a lot of things will continue to evolve. And this is where reason comes in to support our faith. We are not at all encouraged in terms of blind faith. Don't just believe something just because I am saying this or because you read it in one of the books. Use all your own inner knowledge from many previous lives that you've had and understand what are those teachings, which ones make sense to you. And some don't quite fit yet. Challenge, study, go after the right answers. And the last point is that he saw Brazil. He, like I said, the spirit guides saw Brazil as the homeland of the gospel, the place that was far away from the big conflicts that would happen, in a way that they had the population that they knew would be open to accept the teachings and the points. Okay, so just kind of some interesting anecdotes that we've heard about Chico and Emmanuel. Chico often described himself as the pencil in Emmanuel's hands, ready to be set aside if broken, highlighting the lesson of service over ego. So Chico knew, and of course Emmanuel had probably told him, that that ability to be that hand, to be the pencil, was not a guarantee role. Was not his job unless he maintained those three conditions that were given to him. Now, those conditions obviously meant that he had to be faithful to the gospel, to Jesus, to Allan Kardec, that he would not make any money, personal gain. He had some vanities, but he was no saint.
Just his little wig.
The wig. And then the next one is that he had glasses, right? He had vision issues, right? And then Emmanuel encouraged Chico to use those big glasses, right? To avoid vanity. So I guess made Chico look a little bit silly. And to show that just because you're a medium, you're not superhuman. You're not perfect. You have the same deficiencies, same issues. You might have bad breath. You could have a number of other problems. You're not superhuman. In fact, you're a little bit different, but of a capability that we all have. The other thing that was important for Emmanuel to instill in Chico was some thick skin. Because as the first medium that would gain public visibility in a country that was very strongly Catholic at the time, right? Which in some ways challenged the Catholic Church in Brazil, that he would become an easy target for a lot of criticisms. And that's not easy, folks. If you think that, that's okay, that's just Christian, but it hurts, right? It challenges, it makes you wonder if what you're doing is actually wrong or right. And Chico had to endure a lot of skepticism because people didn't believe him. Not that he wanted to prove anything, he just wanted to do his work. So Emmanuel would advise that just be patient and do your work, do your service. Answer these criticisms with more love and more work. 400 books, I would say that's a lot of work. So, just to conclude, Emmanuel, incredibly important spirit in the actual shaping of Spiritism as we know today, through the work that was done to bring this incredible doctrine from France to Brazil, and then foster, kind of nest a very good partner to bring that message to the masses and create Spiritism as we know it. And more importantly than necessarily just the words that are in the books is the example that Chico, through the guidance of Emmanuel, was able to show us how you can blend faith, charity, which is love in action. Thank you very much. A few biographies there if you want to learn more about Emmanuel. I don't know if you have any questions. I'm no expert in Emmanuel, but
There you go.
here's an expert.
No. So thank you, Joe. So if you have any questions, maybe someone from the internet have any questions for Joe? No? No? Okay.
Just one little thing. A lot of books from Andrea Luiz, Emmanuel does the
Introduction. Yes.
introduction. And those introductions are worth to read and study because they are just amazing.
Well, all of these books are worth studying, and I encourage that if you haven't read all of them, start now.
Um,
Yes.
How familiar was Chico to all the works of Allan Kardec? Like, how was that? Was Allan Kardec very well known, widely known in Brazil at the time?
Well, remember that Chico was alive for long, many decades. So in the early days, Spiritism was basically practiced as small family study groups, right? And this is how he got involved in Pedro Leopoldo on one of those. So he was introduced to Allan Kardec's work from the very beginning, right? Again, coincidence? Maybe not. But then only after Spiritism really became relevant through his public image or his public work, right? There was the letters from the mothers of deceased children that was really kind of huge from a publicity perspective. There was his charitable work that he would do, I think Uberaba, right? So he had his own challenges in life. I mean, he had to move from one spiritist center to another. There was a lot of infighting. I mean, we're human, and he was human, and that's fine, right? But without Chico and without Emmanuel, very likely would not be here today in this setting, studying and listening and learning.
There is a question from Leo. Emmanuel's parents was very strict. Other spiritists not that much. Why?
There's some parents that are very strict, some parents that are not strict. It's just the nature. Remember, spirits are not kind of uniform, right? It's not like they all get the same education and the same experience. They're humans like us, right? So we all have our personalities. Emmanuel had his personality. Now, one could also imagine that Emmanuel acted the way he did, because he needed to be this way for Chico, right? Chico did not come from a very stable family, and he had challenges in his mother died when he was young, right? So he had his own challenges, like we all do. In order to follow the path that he did not necessarily choose to begin with, not that he knew, it required a lot of discipline. And discipline requires you to be strict. Well, thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy the day with your moms, if they're available, if they're close by, or spiritually, if they're no longer with us. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for coming today, and thank you everyone on the internet that joined us today. And just one little thing I want to mention that's so important, that always when you see someone being pushed or challenged or asked to do things and challenged with trials, it's because that individual, that spirit is ready for it, right? There's nothing happens by chance. So definitely, as Joe said, Chico was really ready for it, right? And that's why Emmanuel was like, okay, you got to do this, don't slack, just get it done.
He didn't know he was ready.
Yeah, he didn't know, yeah. But it's interesting. So, and then one thing about all of this, like, I always ask this to myself, it's like, would I have said yes when I was called? I always think about it, right? Because, Chico was like, yeah, sure, let's do this. Let's write 10 and then 20 and then the 400 books, right? And this, how many of us would actually, if you're challenged, say, we got to actually do this, right? Mission. How many of us would say, oh, yeah, sure, we'll do that? Or how many of us would say, nah, You know, I'm just gonna chill, right? That's one thing, you know. Every time I think about the story of Chico, I always think about that. Anyways, it's just a food for thought, maybe for later. Anyways, thank you all. And for those of you who are internet, thank you for joining us. We're going to continue now with our passes. And the passes are really a transfusions of good energies, and that's it. So that's all. Keep our minds and our hearts connected with this beautiful energy that surrounds this place today. Think about our Father, Mother, God, and our Master Jesus. And we're going to put some music just to kind of help us relax and connect. And we're going to get started very soon. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jo and Sandra, for coming today. And this is like totally separate. I need to make that little addition here. You know, another reason why TSS is here is because they started it with a bunch of other people, obviously, like it's, but they're the reason. They said, "Oh, here's the reason why we're here in Spiritism." Yeah, and Sandra and Jo coming and starting this whole thing is the reason why we're here today. So, that's another very good reason for us to celebrate to happen here, right? So, thank you, guys.